Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're going to start in the next minute or two. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the third session of today's IPD virtual colloquium titled Canada in a Shifting International Order, Debating Our National Interests. If you have missed any of our earlier discussions, you can catch up by visiting IPD's YouTube channel or our website at peacediplomacy.org to watch the video recordings. We hosted two expert panels, a conversation with Professor Janice Stein, and also heard from Parliamentary Secretary Rob Oliphant. Now, for this session, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce Member of Parliament Garnet Jenis. Garnet represents the riding of Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan in the House of Commons. He serves as the Vice Chair of the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development and is also the Shadow Minister for International Development in the Conservative Caucus. Garnet was first elected to Parliament in 2015. In 2017, he was named the Parliamentarian of the Year by the Maclean's magazine. Jenis has been active on many high-profile domestic and international human rights issues. His interest in human rights was shaped by the experience of his grandmother, a Holocaust survivor. Garnet holds degrees from Carleton University and the London School of Economics. I encourage our viewers to read Garnet's full bio to learn more about his extensive list of accomplishments as a young Canadian politician. He got involved in the politics at a very young age and is still very young as well. MP Jenis, thank you so much for accepting our invitation to join us today. Welcome to IPD. Please go ahead with your opening remarks, and then after that, I'll ask you a couple of follow-up questions. Thank you, and the floor is yours.
Well, wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much for this opportunity. And I want to recognize the work that the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy does and the opportunity to share some thoughts on how conservatives are thinking about Canada's national interest in 2023. It would be common to start a speech like this by saying that the world is changing. Of course, in some sense, the world is always changing. Probably you could say that in a foreign policy address any time in the last 600 years, and it would still be true. It's the nature of the world to change. Sometimes when we analyze world affairs, it's actually more revealing to focus on aspects of the world that are not changing. That is, what are the constants that persist in spite of change? What are the longstanding realities that may be coming back to the fore? I was born in the late 1980s, so as was mentioned, I'm relatively young, and I was born as the first Cold War was ending, at a time that many people wanted to be thinking that this was the end of history. After long-running struggles with communism, and before that fascism, and before that various forms of imperialism, the idea of a democratic, rules-based order had finally, we hoped, won history. The game was over. It was done. We won. In the minds of many, this was an opportunity, therefore, to finally turn our attention away from the existential struggle for our freedom and instead focus on our own comfort and happiness at home. 9/11, which 22 years later we're remembering today and honoring the victims, of course, 9/11 partially shattered that illusion. But even the immediate post-9/11 political discourse saw the values of free democracies as necessarily ascendant and saw the stamping out of threats to such values as a kind of mopping up operation, possible with a relatively limited investment of time and treasure. The subsequent wars associated with the War on Terror were not the kind of mass societal mobilization efforts that we have seen in previous eras. Today, the circumstances have clearly changed again. Today, we can see that what some thought was the end of history was at best more like a holiday from history. And we have returned to what has essentially been the norm in human affairs for most of human history, a situation in which nations, empires, or groups of nations struggle with each other for power, for goods, and for ideological preeminence. To put it simply, history has returned. And I would just make the point that this is not something particularly new or unusual or surprising. This intensifying competition is the return to what has historically been the normal state of human affairs. We should not be expecting the resumption of any holiday from history. Rather, we should calmly accept that such struggle between competing political values has always been the normal state of affairs in the world. The way that we ensure the security of our freedom and our democracy in the midst of such struggle is to thoughtfully engage in that struggle over the long term, not to expect quick or simple victories. So how would I describe the struggle that we are in? On May 2nd, I gave a speech in the House of Commons during which I identified the nature of that struggle. I said the following: there are many ways of framing the new understanding we need to have, but at this point, it is both honest and illuminating to describe the challenges we face in the world today as something of a new Cold War. Although different in many respects, our current reality has many of the same features as the Cold War. We greet this reality with no relish, but this new era of global tensions and conflict is one we must, with sadness, recognize. The world has now two clear blocks of nations that are engaged in both strategic and ideological conflict, each in hopes of creating a world that is more inclined to its own kind of political system. And we have varying degrees of non-alignment between these blocks. If I were to describe those blocks, on the one hand, we have the community of free democracies that believe in, though perhaps do not always perfectly practice, the ideas of freedom, human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. The largest of these countries is, of course, the United States, but Canada is a key part of this community of free democracies, and this community includes many other nations on various continents and at varying income levels. On the other hand, we have a community of revisionist neo-imperial powers. This community of nations does not have the same ideological clarity around its objectives as the free democratic world does, or even what the old communist bloc did. But what unites this revisionist neo-imperial community is its collective rejection of the core ideas championed by free democracies. The revisionist bloc challenges the idea that freedom, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law are essential for political communities. It especially rejects the international rule of law, the idea that states should not be able to acquire territory through the force of arms and without the consent of the people affected. Beijing's Communist Party is the primary player in this bloc, but includes other players, most notably Moscow and Tehran. These other powers, of course, exercise individual agency and have distinct objectives, but they share a common antipathy to Western democracy and oppose the idea of an international rule of law binding neo-imperial powers. They are also increasingly working together. Between these two blocs of nations, we see many of the dynamics of Cold War competition reemerging. So this is what I said to the House of Commons on May 2nd. This use of Cold War terminology is not yet ubiquitous, but my comments on this were not the occasion for any objection or controversy, because I don't think anyone would seriously dispute them. The Second Cold War is now fully upon us. And as with the last Cold War, we in Canada, but also people living under the yoke of oppression, can hope that freedom and democracy will prevail, but none of us can presume that that will prevail necessarily. As I said, our success depends on our ability to struggle persistently and successfully over time. I think in the midst of this struggle, we can acknowledge that there is an essential unity between our interests and our values. That is, that the protection of our values also protects our interests, and I could delve more into this during the subsequent discussion. As we speak about a conservative conception of Canada's national interests, I would identify 4 specific areas where we think more engagement is very important. Strengthening our national defense, combating foreign interference, sharpening our approach to international development, and deploying Canada's energy sector. When it comes to national defense, I think we need to take stock of the significant mistakes that have been made in the last 8 years. When Liberals took office in 2015, they promised a leaner military. They also downgraded our support to Ukraine by discontinuing the sharing of certain satellite imagery at a time when sovereign Ukrainian territory was already occupied by Russia. In the present, of course, we want to see a national consensus on the issue of supporting Ukraine, but an honest reckoning would nonetheless show that the current government has chosen to downgrade support to Ukraine when they initially took office, was reluctant to make the necessary investments in our national defense, and has continued to be slow to apply the necessary sanctions. In general, after 8 years of the current government, Canada's military is in a state of relative disrepair. In spite of dramatic increases in defense spending elsewhere, the government has no plan to ramp up defense spending to meet our NATO commitment of 2%. When it comes to defense spending, a conservative government will get Canada back on track by making proper investments in our armed forces. We will get the brave men and women in the armed forces the equipment that they need to do their jobs and to keep us safe. And we will be a reliable security partner for our allies, and we will contribute to the necessary work of deterring aggression by other actors. We will not allow a situation where Canadian soldiers on deployment have to pay for their own meals and then wait extensive periods of time for reimbursement. We need to stand behind our brave men and women in uniform. So as we invest in our military, we also need to struggle against the problem of foreign interference. Winston Churchill marked the beginning of the last Cold War by describing the descent of an iron curtain. This was a powerful metaphor in the context of that Cold War because of the firm separation that came to exist between the two worlds of that era. And this is the most notable way in which this Cold War differs from the last. Today, we have a Cold War which is taking place in the context of a high degree of mutual penetration between the different blocs. Unprecedented levels of goods and people flow between rival blocs. And this interchange is both a potential challenge and opportunity. It means that both sides are subject to influence of the other, and there's no inevitable primary way that these flows of influence will go. But I think, sadly, under the present Liberal government, we have clearly failed to protect our country from the negative flows of influence into our politics and our institutions. I won't recap the details of the foreign interference scandal currently gripping Parliament. I think they are well known to all of you, but suffice it to say, they underline that we have not done nearly enough up till now. Probably the worst case in the minds of many people I speak to is the presence of foreign police stations on our soil. Protecting our national interest in the midst of this unstable global situation requires us to take a series of robust measures to combat foreign interference, and we are committed to taking those measures. A conservative government would quickly pass a foreign influence registry, would expel any diplomats involved in foreign interference, would ban terrorist organizations like the IRGC who engage in foreign interference, and would shut down foreign police stations operating on Canadian soil. These are some of the important measures that we would undertake. So that's national defense, foreign interference. I think we also need to sharpen our thinking and our approach when it comes to international development. And I serve as the Shadow Minister for International Development, so this mostly closely relates to my own direct work. One way of thinking about a Cold War is through analogy to domestic political campaign. In a domestic election, you need to identify your supporters, your non-supporters, and most critically, you need to identify the undecided swing voters. In order to get the support you need, you have to get these swing voters on our side. Similarly, if we wish to prevail against the aggressive program of the 21st century's totalitarian and genocidal states, then we need to persuade the swing voters, or let's say the swing states, to be and to stand with the world's free democracies. So this is where engagement with the global South, particularly engagement with Africa, is critical. Importantly, our engagement with the global South should not just be in the form of international development. For too long, this has been the only frame for looking at many countries and many peoples with whom we could be having dialogue on a much broader range of issues. We should pursue the strengthening of mutually beneficial trade and strategic cooperation. We should be working to identify and remove barriers that constrain mutually beneficial private sector investment. But international development, our efforts to improve the well-being of the poorest people in our partner nations, is a critical part of how we build ties and strengthen our strategic interests. Sadly, under the Liberals, I think we're failing to recognize the strategic dimension of international development because the government is currently funding aspects of China's Belt and Road Initiative through Canadian membership in the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. We would be much wiser to use those resources to build direct, mutually respectful partnerships with nations in the global South that we should not be putting our dollars behind institutions that are controlled and used by our strategic adversaries. Rather, we should be supporting the well-being of the world's poorest people in a way that builds that also simultaneously builds direct ties between our nation and those nations. And the fourth point I wanted to make about Canadian foreign policy, about advancing Canada's interests, is about the importance of deploying Canada's energy sector. Within the democratic world, Canada has a unique potential vocation. Most of the world's democracies are relatively geographically small and densely populated nations that rely on energy imports. Canada is relatively unique in the democratic world that we are a geographically large, sparsely populated nation with an abundance of natural resources. And this means that we can be providing our democratic partners with energy security and make them less reliant on countries that don't share the same value orientation. Sadly, again, the current government has not recognized the potential benefit associated with our energy sector, both economically and strategically. So this would be a key area of shift in a conservative foreign policy, that we would see it as being in Canada's national interest economically and strategically, and in keeping with our values, to support the energy security of our allies by developing our energy sector and by selling our product to those nations who need it. So in conclusion, as we seek to define Canada's national interest in a world that is in certain respects changing, but also in certain respects not changing, as we seek to define Canada's national interest in that context, we need to be doing our part to secure political values like freedom, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law, values that align with our understanding of universal human dignity. Doing our part doesn't mean doing everything or being everywhere. It means coordinating with our allies to be effective, and investing in defense and security, combating foreign interference, sharpening our approach to international development, and deploying our energy sector are key aspects of it. I think over the last 8 years, we've had a relatively unfocused foreign policy that has nonetheless failed to effectively confront our most important challenges. I think we can do better, and I look forward to your feedback on the ways I proposed for doing that. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, MP Jennings, for, you touched on several different points that I would like to maybe pick some of them and ask you follow-up questions. So first, let me ask you about prioritizing our interests. As you said, we're facing significant challenges, both globally and also in different regions of the world. We have the brutal Russian invasion of the Ukraine in Eastern Europe, a more assertive and emboldened PRC in the Indo-Pacific, Russian buildup in the Arctic, and the fact that we have not paid enough attention to the Arctic for many years, and global issues such as climate change, resilience of supply chain, energy security, food security, and many others. All these challenges have implications for Canada, yet we have limited resources. How do you think we need to prioritize Canada's diplomatic and defense engagements? Which regions do we need to prioritize over the others? You mentioned 4 points: investing in national defense, combating foreign interference, reviving our energy sector, sharpening our approach to international development. All those are valid and important points. But how do you think that will help our prioritization? Or do you think we need to prioritize our focus on some regions over the others?
Yeah, I mean, I think we clearly need to work in effective partnership with our ally to establish priorities and to say what are the areas where different like-minded countries can work more effectively. What are the things that our geography, our history position us better to engage than others? And I don't think it's quite as simple as saying, we're going to be in this region and not that region. I think. But there are certain kinds of relationships in different parts of the world that Canada has historically that we can build on. I think there are diaspora relationships that are very important for Canada's sort of strategic strength, and those conversations kind of can happen among allies about the areas of focus. But I think the 4 points that I outlined do identify thematic focus that's very important for us. First and foremost, we need to protect our own national security, and that means investing in our own defense capacity, and that means combating foreign interference. We can't be effective in the world if we are vulnerable to threats to our own domestic security in the Arctic. We can't be effective in the world if our foreign policy debates are being skewed by foreign interference. So protecting the home front in those areas is crucial. In the area of international development, I think being strategic, where we say we're not actually just trying to be part of every club, right? I think some of the impulse to join the AIIB was this impulse on the liberal side of just wanting to be in all the clubs. That's not in our interest. Our interest is to prioritize the associations of nations where we can most effectively advance our values and our interests. And then in terms of recognizing our unique competencies, the helping to ensure global energy security is something that Canada can do that many other countries, like-minded countries, cannot do because of the resources we have. That developing our energy sector doesn't cost resources. It's a net positive from a perspective of our resources, right? It's about supporting our economy as well as our security. But it's a good example of the sort of thing that Canada is uniquely positioned to do in the world.
Garnet, some experts believe that in this era of great power rivalry, if we want to call it, Canada doesn't have the space it once had on the world stage to have a value-centric approach to foreign policy. What do you think about this view, and how does the Conservative Party intend to align the promotion of democratic values and human rights with Canada's strategic interests, particularly in complex situations where values and interests may appear to be in conflict?
Yeah, that's a really important question. Obviously, there is a theoretical tension, and there's situations that could bring this tension to the fore between the pursuit of our values and our interests. And I don't think I don't mean this as a cop-out, but it is important for us to try to have our cake and eat it too, in every case that we possibly can, because we should recognize sort of a macro unity between our interests and our values, right? What defines our interests in the world? Our security, the security of our system of values, and countries who share our values, who become more democratic, more supportive of human rights, are necessarily more likely to be aligned with us, and to make common cause with us on various other global issues. So the advancement of our values is in our interest, and what defines our interests are the protection of our core national values. So there is a macro unity between those objectives, which means we should try to pursue them in sync with each other. And so I think every individual case sort of needs to be adjudicated individually, and I'm not denying the existence of trade-offs, but I think there are a lot of cases we can see now where the approach of our government actually doesn't align with our values or our interests, and that usually pursuing a policy that aligns with our values is also going to be in our if not short-term, then certainly our long-term interests. So we do need in every case to try to find the overlapping section of the Venn diagram, not to ignore the existence of hard choices, but I would want to underline that macro unity between interests and values as well.
Garnet, let me ask you a question about our relations with China. Given the increased geopolitical competition in the Indo-Pacific region, how does the Conservative Party propose to manage Canada's relationship with China? You talked about this in your opening remarks, but you very well articulated this struggle that we are in between democracies, the camp of democracies versus the camp of autocracies, if we want to call it. Some of the challenges we face, though, for example, climate change. Without many experts, I'm not a climate change expert, but many experts believe that without global cooperation, we will not be able to address these existential challenges. So how do you think, amid this competition between these two different camps, amid this Cold War 2.0, if we want to call it, how do we need to, at the same time, address challenges such as climate change?
Yeah, I think obviously climate change is a significant global challenge, and we would like to see China, which is a massive emitter. We'd like to see the government of China, be engaging that issue. I mean, I think one of the challenges is that there are many ways in which sometimes the environmental rhetoric that comes out of Beijing is disingenuous. We continue to see significant environmental problems. I've been very involved in the Tibetan human rights cause, and I know this is a primary concern of the Tibetan community. The sort of disconnect between some of the rhetoric we sometimes hear and the realities in terms of the policies and their implications in Tibet. So I think we should be doing we should be pursuing the development of technology here at home that addresses the climate change challenges that we face, and we should be calling on other countries to act as well. But I think sometimes what we see is this issue kind of being used as a mechanism of there's some whitewashing, if you like, of China's record that goes along with the issue. I think the other challenge we have to reflect on is that there's a lot of sort of component parts for green technology that are coming from China that have horrific labor standards. So we need to be vigilant about not overlooking the human rights and human dignity concerns in supply chains in the context of discussing the need to get the materials associated with green technology. So look, obviously this is an important area, but a note of caution on how we proceed to be looking at all the realities and also not to be overlooking the human dimension alongside the environmental dimension when it comes to what's in our supply chains.
Great. And my last question for you, Garnet, we have still a couple of minutes left. One of the themes that we've been discussing in today's event has been on multilateralism and how Canada should still engage in multilateral efforts to advance its interests. How vital do you consider multilateralism to be for advancing Canadian interests, and where does it rank among those interests? What do you think should be Canada's main contribution to multilateralism in the years to come?
Well, I think multilateral engagement, especially with like-minded nations, is critical. With like-minded nations, as well as with those swing states that I described, the various nations, especially in the global South, that are sort of navigating the extent to which they align themselves with Western democratic bloc versus a kind of neo-imperialist revisionist bloc. So I think it's just also important for us to be strategic about our multilateral engagement, to engage with organizations and in ways that reflect our interests and values, and not to see multilateral engagement as an end in and of itself. Multilateral engagement is a valuable tool, but it's a means to achieve the advancement of our interests and values. Being part of as many organizations as possible isn't the goal; it's the means towards. I should clarify that the goal should not. The means isn't being part of every organization either. Multilateral engagement is not the goal in and of itself; it's a means to the advancement of our interests and our values.
Great. MP Garnet-Jenis, thank you for joining us today. Thank you for sharing your insights with our audience, and hope at IPD that we engage with you again in the near future.
Thank you so much.
And now for our next session, we have one of our young fellows at the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy who will lead the discussion. I would like to invite Eunice to take over, and the floor is yours, Eunice. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Bijan, and thank you to everybody who has joined us for this session. As Bijan mentioned, I'm Eunice Oladejo, and I'm a young fellow with the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy, and I'll be your moderator for today's panel. So we have three distinguished experts with us today who will be providing their insights and cultivating some great discussions. So I invite them to join us now with their cameras on. So first we have Jeremy Kinsman, who is a distinguished fellow at the Canadian International Council. We also have with us John Packer, who is a Neuberger Jessen Professor of International Conflict Resolution and Director of the Human Rights Research and Education Center at the University of Ottawa. Lastly, we have Pittman Potter, who is Professor Law of Emeritus at the University of British Columbia, and also member of the Order of Canada and Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. So our main question today is what role is there for values promotion in the post-liberal world? So we will be discussing the growing trade-offs between the pursuit of national interests and values, what consequences this might have in a shifting international order, and much more. So without further ado, our panelists will start by providing us with a few opening remarks for about 5 minutes each, which will begin our discussion. And afterwards, we'll be diving into conversation around some main themes. We will also be addressing audience questions throughout, so please feel free to leave your questions in the Q&A box, and I will incorporate them into our discussion. So I'm going to pass the floor over to Jeremy, who will start us off with his remarks. Jeremy, you can go ahead.
Well, thank you, Eunice. It's very nice to see you and meet you at last. Look, I'll start with a real-life foreign policy issue of values and interests. I know that the scholars always find real-life examples annoying, but here's one. It's the end of August in 1991, and Gorbachev is a captive in his dacha in Crimea on the Black Sea, while in Moscow, a coup has taken place. In Ottawa that morning, our foreign minister, caught unawares, asked by the press, "Where's Canada on this?" said that we don't know if we'll recognize the coup people as a legitimate new government or not. We'll have to wait and see. I'm the political director at the Foreign Ministry, and I'm in my office, and the Prime Minister, Brian Mulroney, my boss, calls and says, "Jeremy, what the hell is this? That's not who we are." And of course, he went and communicated to Yeltsin, I think still on top of a tank, that Canada would not recognize this government and insisted on the return of Gorbachev. You know, prime ministers and foreign ministers for about 80 years have been warning Canadians not to create a false dichotomy between values and interests. Basically, they have said that it's a blend. Louis Saint-Laurent in 1947 defined that blend and stating priorities that are still enduring in our foreign policy. They are balancing the US relationship with a multilateralism that puts the accent on humanism, Now, this is both a value statement and an interest statement, but it defines Canada as globalist, not nationalist. I'll give you another quotation. In this spirit, Pierre Trudeau asked in 1981, it was actually the only foreign policy speech he ever gave in the House of Commons. He asked, "Who is my neighbor? Is she the woman rummaging for food in the back streets of an Asian shantytown? Is he a trades union leader in prison in South America? Are they the people dying in Africa for want of medical care?" His concern about the lives and rights of others was actually a comment on power relationships in the world. Trudeau was about to host the first G7 summit ever in Canada a month later, and he planned it to focus on north-south disparities. That plan was rebuffed by our actual neighbor, Ronald Reagan, just elected, supported by Margaret Thatcher. Humanism lost out, in this case, to power. Reagan would focus later instead on promoting democracy as a value. His successor's successor, George W. Bush, took up that torch, saying at his second inaugural, "The survival of liberty in our land increasingly depends on the success of liberty in other lands." Today, the concern of many Canadians and other Democrats is the reverse. Democracy everywhere needs its survival in the United States. But democracy is waning globally, especially in poor and vulnerable countries, because it's not succeeding in producing positive outcomes for hard problems. I found in Russia and elsewhere that the talents and capacities that democracy needs are behavioral. They can't be exported. They can't be imitated. They have to be learned. And institutions and laws help. But the decisive factor is civic engagement. Democracy's building blocks are in civil society. That's where citizens experience agency. It's where they learn the habit of positive compromise. And without compromise, democracy doesn't work. But civil society needs covenant, human, civil rights to function. And as opposed to the aspiration of democracy, civil rights are covenant obligations that can be litigated, even internationally. They're encoded in multiple UN and regional covenants that have been at least signed by almost every country. Canada could lead on growing that global norm, as we did on human security, create a network of like-minded states of North and South to contest the abuse of human rights and to support human rights defenders consistently. As to the globalist value of effective multilateralism, essential to the existential challenges facing the global commons, the critique of the world order from the global South today is that it remains unfair. Putin pretends to lead an adversarial coalition of the non-West that espouses civilizational values that are anti-West and anti-liberal, deriding democracy. Russia cannot credibly lead globally with its state values of forceful repression of rights. But Canada's core value of inclusivity, not competitive identities, is a more appealing value to others. But I'm sad to say we are hardly conscious, much less engaged. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy, for your remarks, and I'm sure we'll get back to a few of those comments. So next, I'm going to pass it over to John Packer, who will make his remarks.
Thank you very much for the opportunity, the introduction, and for the efforts of those to organize this. It's an honor to join this panel and contribute. I'm going to make a few prefatory remarks also to a bit situate this session within what we've heard in the rest of the day. And then I'm going to seek to clarify a little bit these terms which are often interchanged: values, principles, interests, of which there's enormous amount of conflation that's unhelpful. So as prefatory remarks, let me begin with the first statement. We're really late to this topic. The problem that we're addressing today is not new. In fact, it's telling to me that basically 25 to 30 years late, we're now beginning a discussion about whether we're fit for purpose in our foreign policy, in our institutions and mechanisms. I'll just recall the Trilateral Commission report number 45 in 1994 about China's emergence in the world. But let me also tell you that when I was a UN staff member at that same time in Geneva, we suffered the shame. I suffered the shame as a Canadian. I was the only Canadian in the then Center for Human Rights, predecessor to the High Commissioner for Human Rights Office. I was a sole Canadian. And who did we send as the head of our delegation to the Human Rights Commission at a crucial time in world affairs? We sent the wife of the then ambassador to GATT. I mean, that just speaks volumes. I'm sorry, it was not a priority because we were consumed with Quebec independence and the referendum. There are explanations, but we were absent then and we have remained absent since. I can tell a litany of tales. Second point, we have failed in most of our foreign policy interests. To read Louise Blais' report for IPD, it's actually an indictment. It's an indictment of failure. So aside from the gobsmacking remarks and stories about and so forth, the conclusion is whatever we have been doing, we have not largely succeeded in. And this conclusion must be quite important. In fact, we have far too many of these myths. We've heard some of them today. Canada is a middle power. Can anyone explain that to me? This is a near nonsensical statement. The world needs more of us. We punch above our weight. Canada leads in God knows what. Or the utter nonsense of a feminist foreign policy that after 8 years, we still can't articulate what the heck the policy actually is. And at the same moment that Sweden, which did articulate policy, has tossed theirs in the toilet this year. No, I'm not advocating it. I'm just saying, how is it we can't say what the policy actually is? My third point, the rest of the world knows what I'm telling you. The rest of the world sees our incompetence. This is why we are not invited. This is why we are not trusted. So, and at the same time, the world is happy to take Canadian money and play our game. But the idea that we are seriously countenanced is not only false, but it's actually risible. And I have literally been in meetings with senior-most officials who literally laugh, for example, at our last candidacy for the Security Council. When we sent Monsieur Champagne down to New York, thinking there were going to be a series of votes, we weren't close to being in the competition, and we didn't seem to know it. That's a shocking indictment of our own foreign policy competences. So amongst this self-evident failure, I'm now going to say something controversial, perhaps, for those listening. Those who have been involved in this are disqualified from the reform of it. When I read Melanie Joly's remarks on the first priority she gave on the 7th of June for the reform of global affairs, her first priority was improving the conditions of our civil service in the foreign ministry. That is not a first priority of foreign policy. And in fact, she indicated her two second and third priorities within that are increasing diversity and official bilingualism. Now, with due respect, and je peux le dire en français, il y a personne who gives a damn about what language we're speaking or what we look like in our foreign policy. In international relations, which is a hard game of real interests, what matters is our substance of our policy. What are our positions, what we bring to the table? And in fact, what we heard from Melanie Joly is more of the play to the domestic audience, a conflation of domestic and foreign policy. My fourth point, or fifth point, is that the world has changed, and I'll be very brief on this. Just to say the world has changed enormously, including areas we haven't discussed today. The character of the state has changed, less so from a protector and a provider, more to a facilitator and a regulator. Since 2007, the world is now urbanized and increasingly so, and we have 50% of financial transactions in the world conducted in 2 or 3 cities globally. This kind of complex interdependence is such that we haven't grasped it, but it relates to things like transnational repression, currency fluctuations, cryptocurrencies, and so forth and so on. The Westphalian paradigm has changed. No single government can actually provide for alone key solutions to the demands and requirements of serving the state, such as climate change. Even major coalitions cannot. And Canada itself has changed. We haven't discussed today that we have 1/3 Canadians who live in Hong Kong right now, dual nationals. We have millions of Canadians who are multiple nationals. I meet them all the time in places like Juba or in Mogadishu, in positions of government and authority. This is part of the complexity, and we are not dealing with it. Well, just to finish, let me just say, in terms of the clarity I was hoping to bring around values, principles, and interests. What are values? Values are essentially those elements that we seek to uphold, that we believe we deserve of importance. We respond to the question, what is it that we hold high? We have slogans like peace, order, good governance. The Americans have life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. But ones we would talk about would be independence, prosperity, freedom. Those are values. It's something about maybe a way of life. We might say some other expressions to describe it. That's different than a principle. A principle responds to the question of how we actually realize those values. So we might talk about sovereign equality. We might talk about fairness, inclusion, which Jeremy mentioned, development, and so forth. If we talk about a principle of truth, a value of truth, we talk about a principle of honesty and integrity. We might talk about that in courts or in citizenship and many other things. But if we talk about interests, and this is the nub of the point, we're not just talking about values or principles. We're talking now about what are those specific goals which are linked to our needs and ambitions that follow from our values and our principles. We don't repeat the value or the principle. The value of, for example, order is not the interest. We need an interest articulated in specific goals which respond to the question, how exactly do we realize these manifest the values and the principles? And this requires prioritization, it requires investment, it requires a plan. And that's what is so tragic about Canada to this date, not even had a serious foreign policy review, comprehensive review, for literally a generation or two. And that's where we are today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John, for your remarks, and looking forward to further discussion afterwards. So lastly, we'll pass over to Pittman for his opening remarks.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here and honored to be invited to speak, and greetings to my fellow panelists. I would say today that many of the comments that I am going to make later on are drawn from a study on values in Canada's foreign policy prepared for the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada that I did over the last number of years with a number of colleagues like Phil Calvert, Jeremy Paltiel, Carol Samdup, and Leo Shin, but none of them should be held responsible for whatever errors and omissions I commit in today's session. I'd like to clarify first that I am trying to be a nonpartisan law and policy scholar focused mainly on China. I am one that welcomes and embraces policy attention to the irritating details of real life, but I also think it's important to maintain that nonpartisan position. My presentation today, to what I hope will remain a nonpartisan policy discourse, is not intended as a critique of any Canadian political party or its policies, but rather a nonpartisan series of observations and suggestions. Now, some of this has been talked about already, and I welcome that discussion, but as an introductory matter, may I suggest that the apparent dichotomy between values and interests as presented in today's program, not just for this panel, but elsewhere, seems to echo the hallowed debate between realism, recalling Hans Morgenthau, Keyhonen Nye, and others like Kenneth Waltz, whose critique of realism in favor of structuralism and balance of power discourse still exudes realist thinking. So the debate between realism and liberalism, associated going back as far as Kant, Woodrow Wilson, but more recently Stanley Hoffman, John Ruggie, and others. And this debate continues today as per a U.S. Council on Foreign Relations webinar in May this year on the topic. But I would suggest with the greatest respect that dichotomizing Canadian interests and values, whether along the lines of realism and liberalism or some other spectrum, is less helpful than an approach to complementarity. I've written about this in the past, examining China's domestic law responses to international law by reference to Niels Bohr's work on subatomic physics, where apparently contradictory properties of subatomic particles and waves can be measured and understood better through combined study of their complementary conditions and contexts. So too with the intersection of international and local law and norms, which I did on the China front. I'd also point out that Christian Tomasach has much to say on this in the context of international relations with specific application to human rights. So my remarks today reflect my general perspective on the need for complementarity in Canada's interests and values. We can probably take all of today and most of this week and next week too, trying to come up with definitions of what values mean, what interests mean, and so on. And I think that's something that is certainly worth doing, but there's been good discussion of it so far in terms of what those sort of mean. And I will just confine my further remarks to responding to the questions. But I would just start out by saying this is a nonpartisan exercise, and I really think we need to be thinking about the complementarity of interests and values rather than the contradictions. Thank you.
Thank you, Pittman, for your remarks. So we're going to now dive into our discussion, and we'll be structuring it within three kind of key buckets. So firstly, changes within the international environment, and then Canadian values in today's world, and then lastly, looking at Canada's interests within a changing world. So I'm going to phrase this first question to John, but we welcome the input of our other panelists as well. So, John, you mentioned that, the problem that we're discussing here today is not new, and that, we've been absent previously and will continue to do so if, that shift isn't made. And you also mentioned that those that have kind of continued to be absent are not those that will now signify the change. So from your perspective, who is then responsible for, signaling this change for Canada's reputation in a sense, and Canada's championing of values and interests in the world stage?
Well, I think that if we simply watch what most other states do and have done and have been doing for the last many years, they have a consistent, ongoing, sober evaluation within their governments, and not just a foreign ministry. We now live in a world where many so-called domestic lines are actually carrying quite important international files. Louise Blaise references that. And so we need to have a determined, comprehensive approach. We have many capable people. We have great representation all around the world. And I won't use the word representation. We have nationals, Canadian nationals all over the world in all sorts of organizations whose knowledge, competence, networks are plainly ignored. I've seen that myself many times. And I can give lots of examples. I won't waste your time now. But I haven't seen a determined effort in a sober approach actually to do what Professor Potter just mentioned. I don't believe this debate is about, and I don't mean to suggest this debate is about the refinement of parsing terminology. What I was getting at is that the terminology is so lazily invoked that these values that are touted, which itself was a kind of euphemism for other things, with really domestic signaling, has harmed us. It's plainly harmed us. We do not have clear-eyed understanding, and we haven't brought the best and the brightest and various experts together to work out exactly what Professor Potter was saying, or much less on a specific important subject like Jeremy mentioned, around democracy, which is really about the popular sovereignty. What does it mean for the state, and to talk about the will of the state. And the last thing I'll just say in this regard is we heard already today, Jean Charest talking about our mining companies. Does he mean Nevsun in Eritrea? That's not my mining company. Does he mean the companies working in Xinjiang? Because that's not, the Uyghurs. When Dominic Barton is speaking for Canada, is he speaking for Mackenzie, or is he speaking for the Uyghurs? Because he sure as heck didn't speak for Hussein Chalil. So, I think we really need to have clarity about this. And I think there's a terrible conflation. And that's why I was emphasizing the distinction between some of these terms, which do render virtue signaling and do become essentially performative rather than substantive and interest-based.
Thank you for that response. And then also just zooming out, I guess, now to the larger changes in the international environment. And you mentioned that there has been a shift with Canadian values, but also you mentioned internationally, and also interested to hear Jeremy and Pittman's views on this after your response. But with this shift in the international system, interested to hear your perspective on how this has influenced international values and their successful promotion, and whether there is a role for liberal-minded states in an increasingly post-liberal international order.
Well, I would prefer not to talk about these, liberal-minded states. I would rather talk about the quality of the character of interest and the quality of the policy and the practices in pursuit of those interests. Because again, it's not quite clear to me who within these states, part of the complexity of the states we're talking about now, what we've seen is an explosion of non-state actors. We have three American corporations traded on the U.S. stock exchange, which have trillion-dollar valuations, which exceed a multiple of the gross domestic policy of all African states combined. I mean, the control of the public square by social media and Meta and others, is enormous. So I think we have to dial this back a little bit and say Canada, what we understand concretely by Canada, our population within the bounds of our territory, of our identifiable needs, our aspirations, those things which are good in the pursuit of those are good for us, which deliver the ambitions that we have and the needs that we carry. Then we can talk about that. And within that, we have to acknowledge that most of the world, if you read Freedom House reports, I said this isn't new. It's now 18 consecutive years that Freedom House has been reporting the reduction of democracies. I think there's only like about 10 full democracies left in the world. And what we're seeing is that the world is a harsh place. And we need to be sober and clear-eyed in that to pursue these in our interests. We want to remain a free democracy. It's good for us, as Jeremy correctly said, for others to be open and free societies for lots of reasons, investment purposes, trade, and so peace and so forth. But we have to do it from this kind of sober starting point.
Thank you. And Jeremy, I'm interested to hear if you have perspectives on this. You touched on kind of balancing or how the balancing relationship with multilateralism. Also talked briefly about Canada's value of inclusivity when it comes to looking at kind of the difference between values and interests, if there is a difference. So also interested to hear your perspective on, whether there is this shift in the international system. And as John mentioned, when it comes to liberal-minded states, or if we want to talk about Canada in the post-liberal international order.
Well, sure. I ask you, Eunice, put yourself in the position of a top administrator of Canadian foreign policy. You do all of these things. You do all of them. You don't just do this or that or this or that. And you have a sense of what the orchestrated blend is. I think the problem at Global Affairs is simply that they're doing too much other crap about themselves. I absolutely agree with Dr. Packer about that. The world's changes are right there to see. I mean, just look at the data. I can't remember specifically, but I'll tell you this, that the share of the world gross national product of the G7, when I was doing that stuff in, say, 1990, was upwards of 55, 58, 60%. And today it's down to something like 32%. And this is with a population that I think is only 8 or 9% of the world. The BRICS countries that were brought together, I don't know if I have much optimism for that organization as such, because they're so very different, but they represent, in terms of the population of the world, largely because of India and China, of course, an enormous number. I think it's 72%, and they're 47% of the world's GDP. And so there is a tremendous change in productive capacity that insists upon representation in an international system which has been actually created, managed, and sustained and protected in its rules by the founding countries. So that is a very real problem. I don't find, and I spent my whole life dealing with lots of friends and colleagues, not just in the UN system, but in the Commonwealth and Francophonie, and living in different places with all kinds of people from what loosely called is the global South. And their complaints, their grievances today, their anger, frankly, is not about values. They're not concerned about values. They're going to work out gender equity in their countries in time. I mean, the amount of progress in that respect is even larger probably than the progress made in economic growth and in freeing up lives, bringing hundreds of millions of people into the middle class out of poverty. Their concerns are about power relationships, about geopolitics. A lot of them are exaggerated in some ways. What you see is, it depends on where you sit, but the United States had this unipolar moment, which went on for about 10 or 12 years, in which, with a certain amount of delusion, that they were exempt from most of the kind of strictures we had, particularly with the invasion of Iraq. I don't want to get into everything here, but people represents a compendium of experience and memory. And today values out there are not the essential issue. But I will say this: there isn't a poll I've seen, whether from Pew or some other global survey operation, which does not indicate that people in the world, no matter where they live, including in Russia today, and I'm sure in China, though the polling isn't frequent or available, people today, when asked, say that they want to have in their lives basic human rights of the kinds that are in the covenants that their countries, including China, have signed over and over again historically in the United Nations. Those basic civil liberties. I'm not talking about the culture wars. I'm talking about, all of those availabilities. Unfortunately, what happens in real life is that when countries are facing chaos, facing self-destruction, facing the extraordinary problems of African countries today, facing debt, facing drought, facing migration, facing pandemic, and facing the burden of paying for climate, these things actually, are diminished. We have to deal with things in a sense, in a coherent sense. Everybody, every country has to work on everything. And unfortunately, that's not what happens.
Thank you, Jeremy. And as a final question for this kind of theme that we've been talking about, we've heard a little bit about multilateralism throughout the day, multipolarity, and how that has an impact in this discussion. So I'll pose this question to John and then over to Pittman also to answer. So as we head to an era of great power competition, how does multipolarity have an impact within this conversation, and specifically when we talk about Canada's ability to promote its values and therefore its policy goals?
I'll just say I would like to hear what Professor Potter might want to say in the last matter too. Hear what he might add to that. Look, I think this. We spent a lot of time hearing about unipolar world, now multipolar world. I think these are not particularly helpful terms either. I would rather say we live almost in a zero polar world. It's so dynamic, so diffuse. Continually reformed. We just had G20. We've had the BRICS meetings. That the amount of shared positions, or I can talk from an organization I know very well, the OSCE, which was based on exactly a community of values, so called. There was a decalogue from Helsinki and so forth. They're just not. The sharing isn't there anymore. I mean, it's been a long time that there's been a complete nonsense to having dictatorships in the OSCE, and there are several of them. So the truth is that states we all live in a much more complicated world. And we're finding now that there are efforts to align particular interests with different groups. There's a bunch of multilateral organizations being organized regularly now that many of us don't follow or know much about, like BIMSTEC, the Bay of Bengal trade cooperation organization, has almost 2 billion people part of it. It has $5 trillion of trade. There's a lot going on in the world, and a lot of it is not geographic based anymore. Our old notions of alliances, Jocelyn Coulon in a previous session was asking or pointing out correctly that the Western Europe and other group was a legacy of the Second World War. It doesn't make as much sense anymore. Our relationships are more subject specific. So in this kind of complex, diverse world, we need to be able to have sharp understanding of our specific interests, parse out and prioritize those ones, and invest in their pursuit. What are the foundational elements, either because they have multiplier effects or in their core are required, such as rule of law, or I would say democracy, participatory governance that represents the actual population, not dictatorships and so forth. But that's the approach we need to take. We have to find those with whom we can work, sometimes subject specific, not in these kind of grand alliances, and then with agility and with determination, pursue them. And that's the world in which we live in. That doesn't reduce itself to these, again, performative, value signaled declarations, which is just nonsensical and unpersuasive to anyone.
Thank you, John. And Pittman, interested to hear your thoughts on this, and also feel free to also touch on the previous question.
Sure. Thanks very much. Make sure I'm not muted.
You're good.
Okay. Well, firstly, I think I just have a couple of thoughts. First is, I think it's important for us to distinguish between sort of publicly articulated values that political leaders articulate at various conferences, BRICS, G20, and everything else. Because I think to a very large extent, these are basically aimed at legitimacy building. And they often contradict the activities. So the actions of states often, despite statements about values, the actions often contradict those. And China, I think, is a very good example of that. So if we read Xi Jinping's speeches to the UN about win-win and the global community and so on and so forth, that all makes us feel nice and warm inside. But then when you look what China's actually doing, then it makes you less happy about it. And the Belt and Road Initiative, I think, is a prime example of that, where in the BRICS meetings and through his delegates at G20 and so on and so forth, BRI is presented as China's effort to help development. It's China's Marshall Plan and all that sort of thing. But in reality, the reality on the ground is that these projects are intensely abusive, that they displace local workers. They are basically not liked by local people, even though they are welcomed by local regimes because of the money involved. But they certainly contradict many of the quote value end quote statements made by the Chinese regime. And I'm sure we can go through a whole list of international actors and find similar dichotomies between publicly articulated values and behavior. And I think publicly articulated values, again, are mainly aimed at building legitimacy, both internationally at home. And I think the point about the relationship between foreign and domestic policy is very, very well put. I don't think Canada is an exception in this, to be quite honest about it. I think we look at European countries, we look at the US, we look all over Asia. Statements about foreign policy are aimed, public statements about foreign policy by national leaders are often aimed primarily at building a domestic constituency. So we need to take the public statements with a certain grain of salt. The other, and I don't want to get too ornery here, but I have to say that I have often said to my graduate students that there are two words that should be expunged from the English language. One is democracy and one is terrorism, because basically we use democracy to label anything we like, and we use terrorism to label everything we don't like. And as a result of that, both of those terms have completely lost their meaning. And one of the examples of that in more recent context is the debates about whether January 6th activities in DC met the criteria for terrorism in the sentencing of defendants, because in criminal law, there's an add-on, US criminal law, there's an add-on for basically a terrorism add-on to the sentence. And there's been a lot of debate as to whether their activities fit the definition of terrorism. So both of these terms, I think, as Professor Packer suggested, are kind of ill-defined, I think is a polite way to put it. And so I do think we need to drill down, and I think Professor Packer started that, and I think accountability is one of those things, is that accountability of states leads to transparency, and it allows Canada to know better what other countries are doing. And again, China is a prime example. So I think we need to think about those issues. And the last point I would make is, when we look at public attention around the world and the attention to civil liberties, again, I think China is a very good example of this. I think it's fair to say, and I don't want to go down the Mahbubani road of saying people have to eat before they can vote, because I'm not sure I agree with that, but I decidedly do not agree with that. But I think it is true that public sentiment about civil liberties expands as prosperity becomes less of a battle. So when people in China are, as they were not long ago in all of our memories, not getting enough to eat, that's what they worry about. Now they're worried about getting their TVs hooked up, and they don't want to have to pay a bribe to get their cable bill fixed, or they want to get their kids into a good school and they don't want to have to pay bribes to get their kids into schools. So you do see a bit of a sequencing of public attention between prosperity and civil liberties and other human rights. And to be honest, in China at least, I think this is the political economy demographic change that the regime is most worried about, because they realize that they need to provide prosperity to their citizens in order to maintain legitimacy, but they're very aware that that very prosperity is going to invite citizens to be less passive in accepting what the regime does to them. So I just had that thought.
Thank you, Pittman. And moving forward to, I guess, narrow in a little bit more on Canada's values within today's world, I'll pose this question to Jeremy, and then, of course, always interested to hear others' thoughts. So we've talked a little bit about how Canada's values are presented internationally, but kind of looking at the argument that has been posed by some, which is that the West's approach to foreign policy in the post-Cold War period has been heavily value-centric. And some argue that this has been true for Canada, perhaps more than some other countries. So I'm interested to hear how you see Canada's, how Canada has conceived its role in the world over the past few decades, and whether this conception is sustainable.
Yeah, Eunice, I'd like to unpack what you're saying there. I don't think I necessarily agree with you. In the actual practice of international diplomacy and conferencing, I mean, an enormous number of decisions and projects have been undertaken between Canada and other partners and countries, through really very actually comprehensively intelligent, purposeful work. It isn't all driven by values and competitions. I think I agree with Dr. Potter that the problem is often in this compulsion, and it's particularly true of the Trudeau government, of this Trudeau government, to have to address everything in terms that supposedly are going to meet the requirements of a pleasant reaction from political focus groups at home. And everything gets dumbed down and oversimplified. But the fact is that things are going on. I'm going to make a point here that the United States has had real problems in cohering policy, foreign policy. I think it began in the Bush administration with, the takeover by the so-called Vulcans and stuff, and then trying to get out from under the catastrophe of Iraq and various other things. And of course, Trump was a complete disaster. I do have to say that the Biden administration manages in discussion, in conversation over concrete objectives, to avoid these rhetorical flourishes. I mean, people don't address these vocabulary issues at all. I mean, it's purposeful. The Ukraine exercise project, began to be discussed in a kind of a divisive way as being a war between Democrats and totalitarians. I mean, it is fair to say Ukraine is a aspiring democracy, and Putin has been absolutely suppressing democracy in Russia. That's a fact. But that's not what it was about, and that's not what the rest of the world cares about. What is about, we hope the rest of the world would care about, is about the violation of the territorial integrity of a neighbor by force. And that's up in the air because of unfortunate contradictory precedents. But the point I'm trying to make, I guess, is that these things are being discussed in real time by people who know what they're talking about. The problem is that, as that we have said, in every country in the world, every participant or person who thinks about these issues thinks about them from the perspective of the situation in their country. And their priorities are very much for the amelioration of that situation. I came across a horrible statistic today. I mean, it wasn't unexpected, but the way it was put is very revelatory. In the United States today, there are 117 million people whose incomes, personal incomes, on average, are exactly the same as they were in 1980. And yet, in that same period of time, the top 1% of the country has tripled its income. That gap in the United States is replicated proportionately, almost exactly, by the difference in the average income in the United States and that of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. These are the disparities and these are the gaps that are on many, many people's minds as being essentially unfair. And there is no reason why the leadership in this country cannot address them in foreign policy. We can be something of a shit disturber in this area among developed countries. Lloyd Axworthy and Jean Chrétien were with respect to human security. The United States didn't like it, but we did it. We got stuff through. That the International Criminal Court doesn't work as well as it should is a reflection, like the UN itself, that is composed of countries of the divided world that we have. But there's a lot of work to do, and it's going on. The problem is so little of it is coming out of Ottawa. That's the point I wanted to make. And I do agree that there are many people in Canada who want to contribute. Over the last 2 years, I directed a very interesting, almost unprecedented bilateral seminar of scholars, researchers, practitioners, ex-practitioners from Germany and Canada on all of these issues, Eunice. And we included in these panels, because of COVID, we did them all by Zoom. We had a very effective international participation, many people from many countries about these problems. The one single thing, I take many things from these discussions, but the one single thing I'd take from it is that these other countries, not Canada, not Germany, but the countries of Asia and South America, Africa, they don't want to be subjected to some kind of team choosing exercise between have to choose whether they're more for China or more for the United States. And on Ukraine, I'm afraid to say, and I hope that will change, but it's going to take work and a better message and perhaps more sincerity. They don't want to have to choose between Russia or China simply because they don't think it's their war. And I think that endures. What they want is a system that pays more attention to the almost intractable problems of their own countries. There's a reason why 6 or 7 governments across the Sahel in Africa have fallen. They weren't, I wouldn't say Gabon was an ideal democracy, but it was typically taken over as Niger, which was a better democracy, was by a cabal of military officers. Why? Because the problems in those countries are so vast. In Niger, which is the 3rd poorest country in the world, the population today is 20 million. By 2050, it's going to be 70 million. These problems are going to be grotesque for these people. That is the concern, or it should be, of everybody in government. Of course, often it's not. As Pittman was talking about, corruption as being an endemic problem. Well, these things are real, and I just wish that in foreign policy, we could get the wherewithal and the consciousness I'm going to say, as we used to. And it's not because I'm older, but it's a fact, as we used to try to mobilize others in the international community, many of whom are distracted by their own re-election problems and other issues of domestic concern, to focus together on these things. But to do it, you got to make waves. And there's no one right now in Ottawa who's up to doing it.
Thank you, Jeremy. And Pittman, interested to hear if you have any comments on that, and then also on the question that I posed earlier, which was how Canada has conceived of its role in the world over the past few decades and whether this conception is sustainable.
Well, thanks. Well, with respect to the question about not enough efforts on world relations, world order, and so on coming from Ottawa, I think this reflects the reality that the world is no longer a world where the state is the only actor. And so we see lots of restraints on state power through economic actors. I mean, look at Elon Musk intervening in Ukraine. I mean, that's a perfect example of that. But also physical conditions. I mean, endemic disease, natural disasters, climate change. Those are kinds of physical conditions that transcend the capacity of states to manage them. And so there are just so many more actors that have influence, and that means that the state has to be working with others. And so I would applaud the implications of Jeremy's comment that not enough efforts are coming from Ottawa. I would say they need to redouble their efforts, but we also need to recognize that there's a lot more actors out there. By the way, this whole question of complexity, I've been working on a project involving examining complexity and alienation and the way that societies become disassociated and alienated as a result of complexities that they don't have confidence in. So that you'll see that later. But in any event, now on the issue of team choosing, I mean, we heard this throughout the Cold War, and I think Africa was a very major place where this question of we don't want to have to choose between the US and the Soviet Union. In the matter of the Cold War, we just want equitable distribution of resources and so on. So that's been going on for a long time. But the reluctance to choose is also combined, I have to say, with playing both sides against the middle. So that when China and the United States are competing for influence in Africa, many of our friends in sub-Saharan Africa are looking at both and saying, well, we say this to China, and then maybe we can get a concession from the States and so on and so forth. So there's a certain amount of that playing against the middle that goes on even as states profess a reluctance to have to choose. And we saw that actually in the BRICS meeting. But I also think, and this goes back a little bit to the keynote speech, but to some of the other comments, is I think we need to be really careful about assuming that we're in a long-standing condition of bipolarity, a new Cold War, and so on and so forth. I just think we need to be just really careful about that. It seems that the world is already multipolar. And as I mentioned, other forces, economic, social, and so on. And so it's not just between states, it's all these other issues. And see, our challenge, I think, in a policy realm is to avoid, as the generals would say, avoid fighting the last battle. And if we are equipping ourselves to confront the future with the tools that we have learned in dealing with the past, I think we're going to be in for a number of rude awakenings. And so part of our challenge is to look at a future that looks very different from the touchstones or the benchmarks we've looked at in the past, not reimagining the Cold War in a new form, but reimagining a multipolar series of conflicts around many, many different actors. And so the challenge is to look into the future. And again, going to China, I think so much of our policies on China currently, and Xi Jinping has no friend in this house, but in any event, but we have to plan for a post-Xi Jinping China. He's not going to be there forever. And we need to be thinking about what the next generation of leaders are going to look like. And I know pretty confidently that there are many people in the upper leadership levels of China who have very different thoughts about how China ought to work and how it ought to act in the world than we're currently hearing from Xi Jinping. So I think that's just an example of how we really need to plan for a future that may not be very much like the past, and therefore our past benchmarks and touchstones may not be quite as helpful. There might have been another question you were asking. I wasn't sure. What was the last question?
No, you addressed it well. I just was asking if you had comments on what Jeremy stated, and then also on how Canada has conceived of its role in the world over the past few decades, and whether that's a sustainable conception.
Yeah, I really defer to others on how Canada has seen its role. I have a comment in my responses later on to the questions, which is to say, we should be clear that Canada is not a monolith, and neither are other countries. So we need to be careful about generalizing about how Canada sees the world or about how Canada has done things. As we heard this morning, different people and groups in Canada see Canada's role differently. But the policies and actions by the government of Canada can, reflect the intersection of values and interests and so on. But they're really, and it's the same. I mean, this is with China too. There is no China. There's many China. So in any event, but I really defer to the experts on how Canada or the Canadian government has perhaps changed or not changed its perspective on its role in the world. I would just say that we need to, if we haven't done it already, we need to change it because the conditions of the world are changing, and we cannot use the tools that we've used in the past without adjusting them to new realities.
Thank you, Pittman. And kind of the last question for this little bucket before we move on, and I'll pose this to Jeremy and then also to John, and John, feel free to comment on the previous question. But we talked previously today about kind of the main moral issues that we're facing today. And I would say that we are in a time of extreme and competing moral issues, whether it comes to climate change, displacement, disease, natural disasters, continue to dominate the international stage. So is there a place for values promotion in a time of such uncertainty in the international world order?
I don't get the question, Eunice. I guess I'm going to disagree with you. I don't think you could call climate change, we're into this vocabulary issue again. You can call it a moral issue if you want. I mean, it is an existential challenge. The pandemic was an existential challenge for many, many of the people there. I mean, the condition of world hunger, which is driving world migration, 126 million people are displaced today, is existential for these people. And so, yes, I think it's a humanistic issue, but I don't think it's a moral issue. There are moral issues out there, of course, and Putin is trying to inflate, if you want, the issue. It's hardly believable to me, but the issue of morals in the competition between civilizations by hearkening back to spiritual orthodox values of another time. I don't think that's really having any play, but I must say that in many countries I know and that my colleagues know, when you go into Egypt, when you go into most of that part of the world, a lot of Africa, I mean, people's so-called moral values, frankly, their bedrock values, are not entirely the same as ours on such issues, for example, as gender, as sexual preference, as these things. And I'm not saying that there isn't benefit in expressing solidarity for those who may feel themselves repressed by the general climate in those countries, but they're not our countries. And I do really lament the extent to which this radiation back to domestic identity constituencies in this country is inhabiting so much of foreign policy. Gender equality is absolutely, essential. Anybody who works in global economics knows that the beneficial effects of getting rid of the patriarchy in the workplace across the world would be enormous in terms of its impact on relieving poverty. But it still remains an issue. But progress, apart from the mullahs in Afghanistan and the Taliban, it is making enormous progress across the world. I think that its inclusion as a priority pursuit abroad, promotion abroad, on the part of our foreign affairs ministry people in their mandate letters is just goofy. They do not understand the impact that this makes on other countries. We have to show solidarity, and we do have beliefs on this. We can't export them, but we can contribute to their betterment in places. But by making them conditional, our goodwill and participation and development conditional on these things is just ludicrous. And I guess Dr. Packer said that the Swedes had trashed some of this stuff. Well, yeah, I guess they did. They had an election, and it's terribly unpopular in Canada now. And I think it's overblown presence in foreign policy, put there by the Prime Minister's office rigorously. I guess with the best of intentions, has been very counterproductive. But what I really stress is that we can do a lot better. We can draw. I agree with the notion and that Canadian civil society and research capacity and everything else and public debate has much to contribute. Let me just one last point. I have a particular preoccupation. You may know I've done quite a lot of television. Our media absolutely sucks as far as analysis of foreign affairs are concerned. I can understand the print media. They got to sell papers in a terrible environment economically for them. But my God, our public broadcaster, if you look at the CBC website, they don't have to do much. They just have to note that there was an election in Guatemala. There was an election in Zimbabwe. There was an election in Ecuador. You won't find any of that on the CBC website, and very, very little of it on television in English. It's somewhat better in television, Radio Canada in French. And it's a disgrace. We're not going to have a thoughtful foreign policy debate in this country if we don't have it somehow illuminated in our media. And we're becoming a country that is world ignorant. And it's particularly because so many of people in this country come to this country from elsewhere in the world. So there you are. Thanks.
Thank you, Jeremy. And just being conscious of time, John, wondering if you have one or two comments before we move on to our next batch of questions.
I'll be very brief. To a couple things, just to chime in and resonate with previous speakers, which I agree with. Just the question of morality. Look, I mean, as a professor of law, I can tell you that there does not exist a law or even a policy that is amoral. There's a moral element to every policy and law, whether it's a stop sign or which side of the road you drive on and so forth. So I really find this, what happens is people invoke these terms to escape dealing with the hard questions in front of them. I want to go back to complexity and the way the world's changed very briefly, just to say, and then how we deal with that from a governmental policy perspective, because government in the state, as much as it's diminished in terms of its capacity and so forth, matters a lot, especially in terms of lawmaking, especially in terms of treaty making and so forth. I don't think many people know that about half of the world's scientists, natural scientists, live in India. Half of the world. It's something like 300 million Indians now, about nearing the population of all of the USA, is in a kind of middle class economic position. Yeah, they got about 700 million, 800 million very poor people, but they have hundreds of millions of actually middle class Indians buying cars, all sorts of commodities and so forth. So, the world, just in terms of understanding the world, yet I can tell you that if we look at our foreign policy and our government, Global Affairs Canada, there's a kind of determined ignorance. For example, if you just go right now on the website of some of our allies in the Netherlands, for example, amongst the different foreign policy elements they have advisory councils. They've had them for decades. They used to have many more. They've reduced them, but they have a specialized expert advisory council on public international law. They have one on security and so forth. Many countries have this. Do we? Where are they? No, we actually, our foreign policy establishment, meaning the government, excuse it. They don't want to know. I think they're afraid. I'm not sure why. But the number of staff and others I've heard repeatedly confusing routinely what's the ICC and the ICJ, the difference between the OSCE and the OECD, the difference between the Council of Europe and the European Council. I mean, ridiculous level from a professional perspective of ignorance. I use the term determinedly, ignorance. This is incompetence. We have ambassadors who are confused about these ideas. If I compare our foreign ministers, we've had a litany of simply not fit for purpose ministers. I first met Sergei Lavrov in 1994 when he became ambassador to the United Nations. He was 18 years ambassador to the United Nations in New York. After he was a senior official, after he studied at GIMO, the preeminent international relations school, he speaks 5 languages. He's now been 10 years as the foreign minister. And who do we put up against Sergei Lavrov? I'm sorry, it's laughable. We send incompetent persons. So I want to come back to this again and say the government matters, the choices matter, and we are not at this point a serious actor, and it is visible.
Thank you, John. And we're just we'll come back at the end if we have a little bit of time, but just so we're able to move on to the last batch of questions touching on Canada's interest generally in a changing world. And Pittman, I wanted to go back to comments that you made in your opening remarks where you talked about the dichotomy between values and interests and how actually we should look at them as complementary. So I'm hoping that you can touch on that a little bit more. And I'm curious as to what you would say to those who do see Canada's interests and values increasingly at an odds with one another.
Well, thank you for that. So I think we've talked about some of these issues already, but I would certainly suggest that many others would as well, and some of our panelists as well, that Canada needs to do a better job to define its core values and clarify its position on its values in relation to the international community, keeping in mind the distinction between core values that express political, economic, and social preferences of Canadians and core values as defined in international law, like the UN Charter and human rights treaties that Canada has ratified. Now, if we think of the NANOS poll, key values prized by Canadians include equality, equity, social justice, rights and freedoms, presumably charter-based, respect for others, kindness, compassion. That was a recent NANOS poll. And these are broadly represented in the Canadian government's promotion of values of democracy, human rights, and the rule of law, which of course can be broken down further to include issues of inclusion, non-discrimination, gender and racial equality, freedom of expression, and so on. But I do think we need a discussion of what those values are and so on. It will be helpful. Canadian foreign policy.
Good luck with that.
Yeah, I know. I understand. I understand, but sometimes the effort is still not, it's still worth it. Canadian foreign policy interests are broad and frankly often ill-defined. Now, I defer to others like Jeremy, much more knowledgeable than I, and John as well. But many suggest that Canadian interests include independence, multilateralism through global alliances and cooperation, promoting democracy and human rights, and advancing economic prosperity. And I would say that articulating, I'm not saying promoting, but I'm saying articulating core values should be an essential element in promoting foreign policy interests. This should not be a partisan issue. Articulating values is in Canada's short and long-term interests. Values around human rights and the rule of law, for example, directly affect predictability and sustainability of trade, of investment, security, and therefore they safeguard Canada's interests. When I've been talking about human rights in the China context, I have repeatedly made the point that the issue is not about trying to convince China to be like Canada. The issue is about insisting that China adhere to the treaties that it has signed and ratified. And this applies not simply to human rights, but we see the application in trade and pandemic response and climate change and everything else. And so I think it's really important from my perspective to get back to the importance of the rules-based international system, which fails too often than I'm comfortable with, but preserving it and strengthening it should remain a key component in our policy of articulating values and promoting interests. Canada should take a proactive role in defending the international legal order, while also setting an example by improving our own record, our own performance on democracy, our own performance on human rights and rule of law. All of that remains a work in progress and one in need of continued efforts at improvement. And we should demonstrate a certain amount of humility about our own performance in order to have the credibility to have an impact on others. So let me also just suggest that when we talk about the question of there was a question in this bucket of less room for values promotion. I actually don't think there is less room for values promotion in today's world. In fact, indeed, the rise of populism and authoritarianism involve promoting values. They're just not the values that we subscribe to. And in light of this, Canada's responsibility to articulate Canadian values, whatever they are, in the course of promoting our interests is more important than ever. And I mentioned at the beginning that values discourse is often about building legitimacy, and I think that's still true, but there is a values contest in the world today. And it's not that there's less room for values. Values are becoming a key point of conflict between the authoritarian leaning states and populist leaning states and other states. And I think we need to recognize that and be prepared to respond. We should clarify that where collaboration with authoritarian regimes is possible and consistent with our values, such as collaboration on climate change, for example, and where it is not. But we should resist, and this is one of the difficulties with the values discussion. The brutal reality is that the liberal iconography, if you will, of democracy and human rights has been adapted by illiberal states around the world to build legitimacy. China claims it has a democracy. China claims it has the rule of law. China claims it has human rights. And what we're seeing here is an appropriation of terms associated with the liberal world order, but being appropriated by authoritarian regimes to build legitimacy internationally and domestically, but then are distorted and used for illiberal purposes. We should resist that, and we should call it out when we see it. I think I think that would be helpful. I think also we still need to, though, engage with authoritarian regimes like China. And we've had some success with that in the past, and I think that's an important thing to continue to do. We have important opportunities to articulate values and interests by collaborating with like-minded countries. And I think that's a very important point, but it's easier said than done, but it's more effective than individual action. I certainly do not think that a whole series of bilateral ties with other countries is a way that we're going to get very far. I think multilateral action, especially for a power like Canada, is very, very useful. So I would suggest that we think about that, and we should make use of the assets beyond Global Affairs Canada to talk to the business community, diasporic groups in Canada, and so on. So there's a lot that we can do, but I would just say that I think there's not just less. I wouldn't agree that there's less room for it. I would say that there's more need for Canada to articulate our values, not to impose them on others, but to say what we stand for, and to not allow ourselves to become complicit in the appropriation of those and distortion of those values by authoritarian regimes.
Thank you,
Can I
Pittman.
say something in this very quickly? I got three things to say. First of all, to Dr. Packer, I actually offered Sergei Lavrov a job in foreign affairs in 1994. You know, it was done only part in jest. Just to assure you that his qualities then were highly recognized by his fellow professionals. In latter years, of course, his discourse has been disconcerting from the guy that I used to know. But anyway, 2 points. Look, this business, any Canadian ambassador or foreign representative worth her or his salt didn't have to have a kind of an internal debate about what our values are that are being projected. It's like Mulroney. That's not who we are. We knew who we were. Anybody who ever goes to any one of the many immigration fairs that occur around the world will see the literally thousands of people who want to come to Canada. Why do they want to come to Canada? They want to come to Canada for opportunities for their children, but those opportunities for their children reflect their acknowledgement that inclusivity in Canada is we're one of the few countries for which it is a fundamental ethic. I don't know how many times I did presentations in different cities on Canada as a home for others. And you know, if you look over the last 10 years at the various groups who do surveys on the countries that are the ones where other people most want to live, For the last 10 years, we've been alternating with Germany as 1 or 2. And so people have a sense of Canada. The problem is it doesn't enter into the calculus in making foreign policy decisions because of the comms fixation on the political process, which refines or distills everything downward into baby talk that is expected to resonate in the next householder letter from the member of parliament. I mean, that's what it's coming down to. Our foreign policy is essentially unprofessional. So there you go. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. And we have reached the end of our panel. It's now 4:15. So I just want to say a big thank you to our 3 panelists today, Jeremy Kinsman, John Packer, and Pittman Potter. All of their information is available online. So if you would like to reach out to them, you can do that. But I'm going to pass it now back over to Zach, who will close us off. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Eunice, for an excellently moderated panel. Merci beaucoup à tout le monde d'avoir été avec nous aujourd'hui. It was a real pleasure to host so many of you on our platform. We've covered a heck of a lot of ground over the course of the entire day. Apologies for the French or for the bad term they're using heck, but Jeremy said that our media absolutely sucks, so I guess he set the precedent. That's okay, and I agree with him fully. But there are more activities coming up at IPD over the weeks and months ahead, as you've seen in the chat. Our Middle East research team is going to be hosting an in-person conference, the Middle East Strategy Forum, in Ottawa later this month, so please do check that out. And then as a part of this project, Canada's Interest in a Shifting Order, our core project team is in the process right now of producing the final white paper, so please do keep an eye out for that as well. That will be published later in the fall. And also do check out the Policy Options website, IRPP Policy Options, because over the course of this week, there are going to be a series of articles that we are jointly publishing as part of this project that are going to be published a day at a time, as far as we're aware. So please check that out. Check out our website at peacediplomacy.org anytime you'd like to keep abreast of our activities, subscribe to our newsletter. And thank you again to all of you for joining us today for what has been a tremendous set of discussions. Thank you so much.
Thank you.